In 2015, Jody Wilson-Rabould was one of the candidates that stood for election under the Liberal banner of doing politics differently. She won her British Columbia seat and was rewarded by the new Prime Minister with one of the top cabinet portfolios, Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada. Then came the SNC Lavalin controversy, and suddenly she found herself in the maelstrom that is the biggest scandal to have hit the Trudeau government. And of course, she's no longer a Liberal. Jody Wilson-Rabould has also just published a new book called From Where I Stand, Rebuilding Indigenous Nations for a Stronger Canada. Today, she's running as an independent in her riding of Vancouver-Granville. And we're pleased to have Jody Wilson-Rabould onto our program from Vancouver, BC tonight. Nice to have you back on our program.
It's nice to be back. Thanks for having me.
Well, we do, of course, want to talk about the book because I read the book and I'm curious about following up on that. But as you may have heard, we're in the middle of an election campaign, so you're not going to be shocked if I want to ask you some questions about politics too, okay?
Sure, that's fine.
Good. Okay, let's start with the book. The message I basically took out of the book is that it's your view that when governments, Indigenous nations, Canadians, when they work together, reconciliation is possible, and then Canada will become a great nation. In your view, what's the biggest obstacle that prevents that from happening right now?
Well, in my view, I mean, there's a lot of challenges that we have as a country, and certainly one of those challenges is to actually create the space for true reconciliation between Indigenous peoples and other governments. We've made a lot of progress, but there's more to be done. And for me, and what has been talked about within the book for the past decade in speeches, but what has been told to me and the concerns and the place of Indigenous peoples is to create the space for that new relationship based on the recognition of rights versus the denial of rights, which has defined the relationship between Indigenous peoples and Crown governments. So we need to shift that, and in shifting from the denial of rights to the recognition of rights, we will finish the unfinished business of Confederation and breathe life into Section 35 of the Constitution.
There will be a bunch of people watching us tonight who, for whatever reason, don't believe that reconciliation with First Nations is a priority in the country and ought not to be. And I'm wondering what you can say to them to make them reconsider that view.
Indigenous peoples have been here since prior to Confederation. They're the fastest growing population in this country. And Section 35, our recognition of Aboriginal and treaty rights, are in the Constitution. And when we create the space for Indigenous peoples to be self-determining, have the right to be self-determining, including self-government, we enable those nations to rebuild within a stronger Canada. It is reconciliation with Indigenous peoples is the unfinished business of Confederation that for us, for all Canadians, should be a priority. Indigenous issues are fundamentally interconnected with a whole range of issues, whether we're looking at climate change and sustainability, development on the traditional territories of Indigenous peoples. It's an issue that needs to be addressed. Thankfully, Canadians, through reading reports of Truth and Reconciliation, the Murdered and Missing Women's Inquiry, are becoming more aware, taking an active interest and participating in moving towards true reconciliation. And I think that is an incredible opportunity for the country.
I note that the name that you use on Twitter is your Indigenous name. Now, I don't know if I'm saying this right, but is it Puglas? Is that how you say it?
Puglas, it's a name that I was given by my grandmother in a potlatch that she held when I was very young in Guilford Island, in one of the small villages in our territory. And it essentially translates to mean a woman born to noble people.
A woman born to noble people. Okay, there's another word that I've seen used describing your role in your community. And again, you're going to forgive my probably bad pronunciation here. Hiligakste?
Haligasti
okay.
is the role that I play in the potlatch, in the big house in our communities. It is a symbolic role, and as a Haligasti, I guide the Hamatsa, which is the chief in our community, into the big house and prepare him to become a leader.
You prepare the chief to be the leader. Is there some inference in that as well, that you're sort of keeping tabs on the chief or correcting the chief when necessary?
I think that's a fair inference. We come from a matrilineal society where property and names are passed down through the maternal line. And women have always taken leadership roles in our community and in our culture in identifying and preparing individuals to be chief.
You probably know where I'm going next with this, which is, were you drawing on that when you had to face down the Prime Minister over what you saw as his inappropriate interference in your role as AG on the SNC Lavalin business?
Well, I have had a vast array of experience and have held many different roles, including being the regional chief for British Columbia and having had the honor of being the Minister of Justice and Attorney General. And my culture and my teachings from my grandparents and my parents of knowing who I am, knowing where I come from, understanding my rights and knowing that I had a role to play in ensuring that the community functions well. I was raised to believe in equality and inclusion and to speak the truth, which are teachings that have guided me through the various roles that I have had, including being the Minister of Justice and the Attorney General of Canada. In my culture, which is an oral culture, if one doesn't speak the truth, then the culture dies. And I have always taken on every role that I've had, including being the Attorney General, with the knowledge that it was a great responsibility. I clearly understood the role that I had as the Attorney General, and I was doing my job to the best of my ability, and that included ensuring that we upheld the rule of law and maintained the independence of our institutions.
In Canadian political culture, however, they call the Prime Minister the boss for a reason. And we clearly had at the very least, a culture clash here in what you saw as your responsibilities and perhaps what he and his office wanted you to do as he saw his responsibilities. How do you think we reconcile, or how do we make those two cultures better understand where the other person's coming from?
In terms of a clash of cultures, I came to federal politics coming from an Indigenous political world where there were no political parties. We tried to, as best as we could, function on the basis of consensus-based decision-making, which doesn't mean that everybody agrees, but what it means is that we vigorously debate and we identify a goal and an objective and we work towards that objective, ultimately seeking to improve the quality of life for people. That's the backdrop that I come from. And entering into the federal political world where there are political parties and understanding, as I did, the nature of partisan politics, but becoming more involved and being in the center of that, realized the hyper-partisan nature of politics. And while, of course, I appreciate and understand the role of being Prime Minister and the extraordinary number of decisions that a Prime Minister has to make, there are 338 members of Parliament in the House of Commons, all of whom come from every corner of this country. And bringing 338 people together to debate and have discussions around important issues, I think it's important to move as much as we can away from that hyper-partisan nature that is very adversarial and not necessarily conducive to having the necessary discussions that we need to have on important issues like climate change, like Indigenous reconciliation, like healthcare. We need to take the best solutions that we have and work as much as we can towards that consensus-based decision-making to be able to determine what we do, how we take action on particular issues, so the action that we take stands the test of time. So the partisan world, the hyper-partisan world of Ottawa, I think could, stand to learn some lessons from the culture that I come from that is more collaborative and seeks to build consensus and, in this sense, work across party lines to try and solve the big issues of our time.
Well, you are indeed putting your money where your mouth is because, of course, you're standing as an independent candidate for public office right now, going back to your roots, if you like. But you also know that in the Canadian parliamentary tradition, you are spitting into a hurricane right now in some respects, because even if you win, very little ice time during question period, no guarantees about memberships on committees, not necessarily, certainly not sitting in a caucus, and obviously compared to your last job where you were a senior cabinet minister, nothing like the kind of power and influence that you would have enjoyed once upon a time. So I think it's a reasonable question to ask, why do this?
Well, I mean, it's a reasonable question to ask, and believe me, it was a question that whether I was going to run again or not, was a question that I had to consider seriously through talking with my husband and my family and people in Vancouver-Granville. I entered federal politics for a reason, for many reasons, and I believe fundamentally that my voice matters, like the voices of all Canadians matter. I want to work hard to achieve true reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, to work on climate action, to talk about social justice issues. And for me, I never expected to be in the position that I'm in, having been removed from the Liberal caucus by the Prime Minister. But I'm embracing the place that I'm in terms of running as an independent, having been an independent member of Parliament for over 3 or 4 months now. It's an opportunity, and I feel that as an independent, I can continue, even more so, directly represent the issues and the concerns of the people in Vancouver-Granville, in Ottawa, versus what seems to be the case to a great degree, members of Parliament representing Ottawa in their ridings. I think that, and I've learned very well over the last number of years, that members of Parliament seem to be answerable under the current party system to their leaders or to the Prime Minister. And I think that's the wrong way around. I believe that leaders of parties, the Prime Minister, should be answerable to members of Parliament, and in turn those members of Parliament are answerable to their constituents in the ridings where they come from. That's where representation comes from. That's where we can ensure people's voices matter. And, I have the opportunity and will continue to work incredibly hard to try to show as best I can that independents can win a seat. If the voters of Vancouver-Granville renew their support for me, we're going to continue to work hard on our campaign. I know that running and winning as an independent is not something that happens every day. But I've received support right across Vancouver-Granville and right across the country, for that matter, of people saying, one, thank you for what you did. It's really important for me to see somebody acting with integrity and based on principle, and people talking about the very nature of our democracy, the rule of law, and talking about the independence of our institutions, and how if we want to make important decisions on all of the issues that are confronting us, we need to be constantly vigilant about our institutions, about the rule of law, and what has made our country one of, if not the greatest countries in the world. So I find it amazing and very empowering and hopeful that individuals that I talk to are having those conversations and wanting to see a different way of doing politics, want to see a different way that decisions are made, and hear their voices in those decisions.
There's no doubt people did say those things to you, and I heard people say those things about you as well. However, in fairness, I also have to say that I heard people say this is a team sport and she wasn't a team player, and that there was a lack of loyalty to the leader, there was a lack of loyalty to her fellow caucus mates. Yes, the Prime Minister made the decision to kick her out, but in fact all he was doing was reflecting the views of the vast majority of the people in that Liberal caucus who felt that they couldn't trust you to sit with them anymore. Could you address that?
Yeah, well, there wasn't a vote that was held, and I'm not disputing that, several of my former caucus colleagues, many of them wanted me to be removed from caucus, but that was a decision that was made by the Prime Minister. And, I've heard people talk about politics being a team sport. I believe fundamentally in the team and teamwork. I come from a culture that knows that if people in their community are prohibited from playing their role, then the community suffers. That's the nature of the place that I come from. But I don't believe that politics is a sport. I believe it's incredibly important and serious undertaking that people commit their time to in terms of public service. I am an incredibly loyal person, but I don't believe in blind loyalty. I was, if we're talking about the past 8 months and prior to that, I was doing my job as the Attorney General, and I will not turn my back on the principles and the values in which I was raised, and my fundamental understanding that if we fail to uphold the rule of law or we trample over the independence of our institutions, then it has an incredibly detrimental impact on our democracy. And for that, I know and I feel comfortable with where I am, and I know that in doing my job, I can look myself in the mirror every night when I go to sleep, knowing that I did my job and what was appropriate and what was based on principle.
Sorry, yeah, I hear what you're saying, but even if you win, you know, there's 338 of you up in Ottawa, and one independent voice in what will otherwise be presumably a sea of very partisan MPs playing politics the way it's always been played. Well, how do you like your chances at sort of fundamentally changing the system to a more collegial, collaborative, less hyper-partisan place when you're one of 338?
Well, I mean, to start, I don't think just because this is the way politics is done doesn't mean that we shouldn't attempt to change it or work hard to change it or think that there is a better way to do it. And I know that I'm not alone in that. I'm hopeful that there will be more independent voices in Parliament. I'm hopeful that there will be more independent, what I call independent partisans, people within political parties that want to create a better system in terms of making decisions. It may start with 1, 2, or more people, but there's an opportunity. I think there's an appetite from what I hear from thousands of people to look at the way our politics is done, look at the way decisions are made, look at the standing orders in terms of our parliamentary process for who gets to sit on committees or who gets to sit in the House of Commons. And this is not something new that I'm raising. There are incredible members of Parliament within all parties that have had these conversations and have put forward private members' bills, whether we look to Michael Chong or Elizabeth May, or there are MPs within the Liberal Party as well and in the NDP that have sought to change how decisions are made and how individual members are represented on committees or how they get to speak. But also there's other democratic reforms that we can look at, including electoral reform. I mean, this is a conversation that I believe is going to be had throughout the course of the election. Certainly, I know people raise the idea around changing the nature of politics to being less adversarial and trying to work more collaboratively across party lines. The role of an independent can be somewhat of a bridge builder between and among the parties. It depends how the seats roll out come election time or after the election, whether it's a majority or minority government situation. But yeah, I believe there is a role for independents to speak up about the issues that are important for their constituents. And having been an independent before the House rose in June, I've had more conversations in those couple of months than I've had to a great degree over the time that I was in government. And those conversations are important. And the recognition that I think all 338 members of Parliament come to Ottawa for a reason, have issues that they're passionate about, and it's important that those voices be heard. I mean, no one political party has a monopoly on the truth or has a monopoly on the important issues or solutions to the issues of our time.
In our remaining few moments here, I want to beg your indulgence and play a piece of tape that you've no doubt seen 1,000 times, but not all of our viewers will have, and it's interesting that you know, there were some first generations at this, and now there are some second generations at this. Your dad and the current Prime Minister's father, 36 years ago at a constitutional conference, had a moment which was really quite extraordinary. You were 12 years old at the time, and it went something like this. Sheldon, roll it if you would.
I have two children in Vancouver Island, both of whom, for some misguided reason, say they want to be a lawyer. Both of whom want to be the Prime Minister. Both of whom, Mr. Prime Minister, are women.
Tell them I'll stick around till they're ready.
Apparently, your dad thought when you were 12 years old that you were thinking about being Prime Minister. And I want to know, now that you're no longer 12 and you've been elected, does that job have any appeal for you?
Well, I'm focused on Vancouver-Granville and being the best member of Parliament.
Now, I expected you to say that, Jody Wilson-Rabould, but I'm looking for a somewhat different answer. If you wanted to be PM when you were 12, is that something that might appeal to you going forward?
Well, I'm happy to answer the question. I mean, I've heard that clip from my father played and replayed, and I appreciate it, and it makes me proud. And it makes me proud not because my father, and it wasn't me, my father envisioned me or my sister having the ability to become the Prime Minister, but what was the emotion behind why he said those words. This was a time soon after Section 35 was placed into the Constitution that recognized and affirmed Aboriginal and treaty rights. And my father, in those words, was speaking of the pride he felt for the space that has been created and the ability of Indigenous nations to find their place within this country and rebuild. And he was proud to speak about his children and the opportunities that his children would have within this country. If you work hard, if you have a plan, you can achieve anything that you want to do. I mean, I would love to have talked more about from where I stand and the discussions that we've had as Indigenous peoples over the past decade and before that. But there's a real opportunity here, and that's what was expressed in my father's words, a real opportunity for us to embrace the idea of true reconciliation with Indigenous peoples based on the recognition of rights. And if I can contribute towards that discussion through this book, through my work as a member of Parliament and beyond on other really important issues, then I'm clearly committed to continuing to serve as the Member of Parliament for Vancouver-Granville.
Okay, in our last minute, let me ask you one last thing. And I note, I read the book pretty carefully, and I note that the letters SNC appear only once in the book. So people should know this is not a book about that part of your life. It really is about the other things that we talked about off the top. But I do want to ask you this. There's been so much analysis and so much discussion of how everybody handled that whole thing. And I just wonder if you, with the benefit of admittedly 20/20 hindsight, would have done anything different.
Yeah, I mean, on that issue on SNC, I have been asked this question before, and I wouldn't do anything differently. I am comfortable with what I have done on a personal level in terms of my role and responsibility as the Attorney General. I do regret that this discussion has continued, that actions weren't taken to address this issue more expeditiously as soon as this arose. That's what I regret. We didn't have to be in this place. You know, there's some lessons for sure to be learned from the last 8 months, and these are lessons that we've already talked about the nature of our democracy. But I had never put out there that this was a tell-all book. That was something that some people in the media and various other people were saying it was. This is a book about reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. It's an opportunity to elevate this issue as being an important one for our country. And at some point, there will be an opportunity for me to tell more of my story, my personal story and experiences. But this is an opportunity to elevate these important issues, that of Indigenous reconciliation, and hopefully get that to be a topic of discussion as we move into the 2019 federal election.
And we are happy to remind people the book is called From Where I Stand. It has brought Jody Wilson-Rabould onto our program tonight. We thank you for sparing the time for us and wish you well in your quest to become the independent MP for Vancouver-Granville. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.